You're listening to a rebroadcast of Murder in the Black. As we revisit this case, we're also looking ahead. New episodes return January 8th. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other, and thank you for being here. Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today.
Grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, or your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it.
Coming hot in DeKalb County. We just left DeKalb, but we back. 1996, DeKalb experienced issues with corruption involving former homicide detective Sydney Dorsey and police chief Derwin Brown. Now, the election for sheriff turns up something tragic between these two men who seem destined to spark change. Derwin Brown was a police officer from New York whose great aunt lived in Atlanta. It was his great aunt who eventually connected him with his wife, and eventually he moved down to Atlanta to be with his wife. Their house was a popular gathering place, and they were well known in social circles. I mean, when you think about their house, think about that auntie's house that is always popping. She always got snacks. It's guaranteed to always be a good time. This was Derwin and his wife's home. Now, Derwin was not only good for a good time, but he was invested in change. I mean, hence him becoming a police officer, but doesn't always mean that, right? But for Derwin, that was the case. He was a part of the police force, but that was only a part of his journey. It was the beginning, really. People called him a visionary. He adopted youth into his home. He always had somebody in and out of his home, which reminds me a lot of my dad, always adopting somebody into the fold and trying to help them get on the right track. He wanted change to happen, and he believed that it could only happen from the inside out. Now, in 1996, an opportunity presented itself to Derwin, and he decided that he wanted to reform the department there in DeKalb County, and he ran against 5 other people, including homicide detective Sydney Dorsey. Sydney Dorsey was one of the investigators during the Child Atlanta murder case. I want you guys to understand that the Atlanta child and murder case is a case that I want to do here on Murder in the Black, but it's so layered, and I'm dedicated to doing it, but it's a very layered case, and it changed the face of Atlanta forever. But not only did it change the face of Atlanta, but it changed the face of the way we look at where your child is. And one of the phrases that they used during this time on the news was, "It's 10 o'clock at night. Do you know where your child is?" And that was like a slogan that went along in Atlanta, but it made its rounds nationally. I mean, I remember talking to my brother who's older than me, and he said, "Oh yeah, like I definitely remember that slogan." And it changed the way parents cared for their children, in a very national way. Now, white officers didn't have a rapport with the Black community at that time, and they needed somebody to come in and serve as a intermediate person to discuss things with the Black community, somebody they trusted. And it was Sydney Dorsey. Sydney Dorsey was that person. And actually, Sydney led the search to the home of the person who was eventually charged with the Child Atlanta murder cases. And you have to know that that case in particular was about the murders of Black children. So they definitely needed somebody who was acquainted with the community. And Sydney Dorsey was that person. He was deemed as an anti-establishment. And MD and I have talked about a lot here on Murder in the Black that, the police is a fraternity of its own. Whether you be Black, white, regardless of your race, they protect one another. And Dorsey really was the person who stepped on the scene during this 1996 election that was not trying to be a part of that, if you will. He was trying to change the way that things were ran in DeKalb County, and a lot of change needed to be seen. Now, Dorsey's family was prominent. His father was a pastor. They had been in the community for years, and he was known. In the 1996 election, he ended up beating out everyone, including Derwin Brown, and he became the first African American sheriff there in DeKalb County. Now, although Derwin was not the person that they chose, he was very happy for Sydney's victory. He interpreted this as, although I didn't win it, it's still a win for us. It's the first Black sheriff. This is, a win is a win, if you will. Many had hopes that Dorsey would tackle the noted corruption that was there in the sheriff department. But after a year of his tenure there in office, they really felt like he was using his power as a part of the establishment. He wasn't doing that anti-establishment thing he promoted during his campaign, and he was using his power to fire and hire many people that people in the community felt like should not be fired or hired. He was using his power at will. Derwin felt like Dorsey wasn't doing the right thing, and after a year and a half, he felt it's time for me to step back on the scene despite his loss, and he announced that he would be running for a second time in 2000.
During that campaign, Durham was committed to interacting with the community, and people felt like he was the underdog, while Dorsey was, the presence of this political power figure. Dorsey had that personality that just drew people to him. But Durham ran a grassroots campaign, and he made his presence known in the community. He didn't have the financial backing that Dorsey had, and many people felt he didn't have a chance. He wasn't just the underdog, he was severely underestimated. When it comes to campaigns, money means a lot, and having that financial backing is super important. On July 18, 2000, they awaited the results of the election between Dorsey and Derwin. The polls closed, and the results were inconclusive. It wasn't like a landslide win. Neither side had achieved that majority of 50% plus one, which led to the necessity of a runoff. So on August 8th, the polls open again for this runoff election, and the numbers come in, and Derwin Brown won. Okay, the underdog, the guy that didn't have the financial backing, the grassroots political figure, he won. And the community and his family, everyone was just excited. He defeated Dorsey 2-1. His dream had finally come true. And Dorsey, he was shocked by his loss, which I think really makes sense, because it is very difficult to unseat an incumbent, right? So if you already have the seat, it's likely that you're going to win. But he didn't in this case. And Dorsey, he didn't call Brown to concede, which is what you typically do. If you lose, you call the other person and you concede, and you let them know, hey, I'm backing you. You won. Good fight. It's just, that's the way that you do it. That's the process. That's the procedure. And, Darwin was kind of let down that he didn't do that, but he was ready to do what he needed to do to take over and to do what he felt his campaign was all about. Now, during the 4 months before Derwin ended up taking his office officially, he didn't sleep on that. He used that time to begin putting into place all the things that he said he was going to do. He began trying to enact change and getting into the books and figuring out what is his transition strategy. He was ready. He was ready to bring about that major reform that he spoke about in his campaign. He was ready to transition into that sheriff's department and make some major changes. Derwin had a hunch that there was more corruption in the sheriff department than what he initially thought, and he worked with the DA to start an audit. And that audit showed that Patrick Cuffee, which was Sydney Dorsey's assistant, was the second highest paid employee in the payroll department. It also revealed that his overtime hours were affecting the system, which led to him earning double in overtime plus the salary that he was already getting. Cuffee wasn't the only one. There were a dozen more employees that were going against the rules, that were earning well above what they should have been earning. And Derwin made a list of those individuals because he felt like they needed to be fired. And animosity within the sheriff's department started to build.
Derwin Brown decided, out of that list that he created of people who needed to be fired, he decided to send telegraphs to those he was going to let go so that they would have time to find another job and go on about their business, have them to prepare. It was a new sheriff in town, pun intended. And as a requirement to become being sworn in to become the sheriff, he had to attend sheriff school. And he did so, and he completed it on December 15th of 2000. He graduated from the Sheriff Academy, and his family celebrated him graduating. And to boot, it was also his wife's birthday. So his wife decided to go ahead of him to their home to prepare for the birthday festivities and the other celebrations that would be taking place that evening. And Derwin came after. And it was around 11 p.m. that Derwin arrived home with roses in hand for his wife's birthday when someone came from behind a bush holding a pistol and started firing. Phyllis called 911 believing that the gunshots had been fired next door, or maybe they came from, somewhere in the neighborhood. She had no idea that it was in her driveway. Upon realizing Derwin's car was outside, she quickly ran towards the scene. Derwin was shot 12 times. 2 shots were lethal, but not immediate. So he bled out. And the news traveled amongst his family, and they were devastated. At first, they believed that this was just a dispute that Derwin was involved in, trying to make cooler heads reside, and there was no way that he could have just been shot. They eventually found out that Derwin was targeted and that he would not survive. Based upon initial investigations, they believed that it was multiple shooters. They looked at people in the immediate family. However, it quickly turned up that there was nothing there. The family wasn't responsible. This was a targeted assassination. Just to give you an idea of the climate at that time, a judge had actually been killed in a neighboring county. The whole law enforcement community, and I don't just mean police officers, I mean judges, people of the court, they were petrified because they believed that maybe someone was targeting law enforcement. They went, of course, and checked on Sydney Dorsey and his wife. And Sydney Dorsey and his wife were home all that evening. They appeared to be fine. But this question loomed amongst the community. Who was responsible for killing Derwin? Now, many people were being fired during this time. As we already said, Derwin had already made up a list and sent them telegraphs, put them on notice that they were going to get fired. So this made a lot of people to believe that there were a lot of vendettas. Anybody could have done it. And one of the other people that they checked with was Patrick Cuffee. Now, Patrick was the second-hand man that we spoke about, the person who was getting all the overtime in the department. And he said that he was with the sheriff deputies all evening. So they were one another's alibi. They could confirm that, yes, Patrick was with us and we were with him. It's like the perfect alibi. The day of the funeral, however, was extremely sad for the entire community, and everyone who was anyone was at that funeral. It actually seemed very presidential. If you look at footage of his funeral, it was as if the president had done it. Everyone was there in their uniforms, and Derwin Brown was laid to rest in the sheriff uniform that he would never get a chance to wear. But back to the investigation. They didn't have a weapon. They didn't have any eyewitnesses. They were literally at ground zero in this investigation. And a lot of people felt like they would never find who killed Derwin Brown.
They had the GBI, the FBI, ATF, local PD. I mean, any organization that was an organization was out there helping, and they just needed a witness or evidence, something to help them figure out what happened, who did this. Months passed, though, without any arrest, and even his wife believed that the authorities would not find the killer. A year later, police respond to a shootout, and it was in Patrick Cuffee's front yard. Now, Patrick was no longer a part of the sheriff deputy, and he was unarmed, but his friend who was there was not unarmed. He was armed, and his friend killed a drug dealer. So the Georgia law allows for a person who is involved in a crime, whether directly or indirectly, to be charged with felonious murder, which they did since it was his property. Patrick's trial, to answer for his crimes, he went to the DA with information. After losing the race, Dorsey called him to his private residence, and he wrote down something on a piece of paper and handed it to him and said, "Kill Derwin Brown." He tore it up and ate it. And by
So
we're talking about Cuffee.
we're talking about Patrick. We're talking about Patrick. And that just sounds crazy. I mean, there's just some things in life where you're just like, and you can't make that up if you try. This is how crazy it gets. You tore up the piece of paper and ate it.
And ate it. Because also, why did we write it on a piece of paper, Steph?
Because if somebody was listening, if there was somebody, they were being careful. I mean, like I said, this sounds like a movie script. Like,
this sounds
in
like
case somebody hears it. Yeah,
right.
In case somebody hears it, in case we got a tracker on something, you just can never be too sure. So we're going to write it on a piece of paper. We're going to eat it.
Now you read it, and now you eat it.
Right. Right.
So Patrick, he had, as he's giving this information up to the DA, he implicates his own self, right? And he says that, was this a
ploy to save his own skin?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Patrick implicates his own self, and the DA is having to question, is this a ploy just to save his own skin? Like, he's on trial? Is he just trying to get out of this? 3 other deputies were involved, however. David Ramsey, the backup shooter, Paul Skyers was the driver, and Melvin Walker, who was the shooter. And they supported Dorsey with the expectation that he would be reelected and provide them with comfortable positions. So this is what Patrick is telling the DA. Now, Dorsey desired this outcome before leaving office, hoping it would allow him to remain in power. If we can kill Derwin before, the transition happens, before he's sworn in, then I can remain in power. The DA started to examine Dorsey's campaign for sheriff, and they requested the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, so the GBI, to conduct a corruption investigation.
This is getting right into the thick of things. Now, Dorsey, they also find out, and this is where we can this is where we pick up on RICO charges. They're coming in to because not only was he going to be charged with murder for hire, but he also was going to be charged with some RICO. Dorsey was extorting a bonding company there in the county, and he advised that person which was a woman. He advised her that if she did not give him money, that he would no longer allow her bonding company to operate inside the jail. And he would make her also, in addition to extortion, he would also make her perform sexual acts in order to keep her bonding company inside the jail. So he's involving himself also in extortion and also prostitution. and coercion, right? Like, because if she didn't do it, then there was going to be a result. So she was scared. And he always had a gun during their sexual acts. So she felt pressured that if she did not perform these sexual acts, not only would her bonding company not be allowed to function there in the county, but also she may die. While Dorsey did possess a motive, it was necessary to substantiate all of this information. Cuffee actually was going to be their star witness, and because of that, he received immunity to testify against Dorsey. But additional witnesses were needed to corroborate his statements for credibility because Cuffee isn't the most credible person. You know what I mean? Like, even though he got immunity, you're not the most credible. So they called Skyers in and interviewed him for hours. Skyers was the person who was the getaway driver. He was offered immunity in exchange for admitting to his role as the getaway driver and identifying where the gun was located. Now, mind you guys, by this time, we're about 2 years away from when Brown was killed. He claimed that the gun was disassembled and they found it in a body of water. I can't tell you guys where it is. I don't recall. But they found it in a body of water and they were able to recover all of it. Like, talk about the perfect timing. On December 1st, 2001, Sydney Dorsey voluntarily surrendered himself to the DeKalb police. He had on body armor as he was shuffled back and forth to court, and deputies were around him as they feared that because the case was high profile, that somebody would try to assassinate him. Dorsey had a following for his innocence, and he claimed his innocence. He said he had nothing to do with the charges, including the RICO charges and extortion charges. He had nothing to do with that. And he had built quite a following. He was a known community servant. People loved him. He was a political figure that people adored. And a lot of people felt like he was innocent. Melvin Walker and David Ramsey, who were the other two deputies that we mentioned, they also were charged with murder. And they went to trial first. They pled not guilty. They believed they had a strong case. They had Cuffee. They also had Skyers, who both had immunity. It lended to the credibility of Cuffee. They had these two people, and they had the gun. So they had a strong case. But after a 2-week trial, they concluded on March 25th of 2002, and the jury reached a verdict finding both men not guilty of murder. Everyone was shocked by the verdict. The family, the community, they were acquitted outright. And the DA couldn't file any more charges because that would be double jeopardy. Yikes, is all I can say. My God.
And on June 17, 2002, Dorsey stood trial in Albany, Georgia, projecting confidence that he too was going to get this acquittal. I mean, how could he not? His alleged accomplices did. They had over 55 pages of corruption and murder charges. They wanted to prove corruption first, and that would then prove the murder. Patrick was the star witness. He testified that Dorsey claimed Derwin was going to kill him first. So we got to kill him because he's going to kill us. So we got to kill him.
Okay, what? Fire, maybe. But
Oh,
get you in trouble.
Kill. The defense, they couldn't rely solely. We already talked about this. Steph talked about we can't solely rely on Patrick's testimony because he's not credible. So they brought in Skyler and, he testified. And they hoped that by having Skyler and Patrick's testimony, that they would be able to avoid an acquittal. But on July 10th, 2002, the jury reached a verdict in a case that it relied solely on circumstantial evidence. Dorsey was found guilty on corruption, and he was found guilty on the murder charges. Now, he was acquitted of the bribery charge and the extortion charge, but he was found guilty of the charges that, truly, at the end of the day, mattered, that murder. And he maintained his innocence. He maintained it all the way to the end. He claimed he didn't have the blood of Derwin Brown on his hands. Phyllis Brown, however, Derwin's wife, spoke, and so did Derwin's daughter, and they made it clear what Dorsey took from the Brown family. Dorsey was sentenced to 23 years for the corruption charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison on murder.
To slip right into our takeaway, we're going to tell you a little bit about the acquittal of the gunman that we talked about, because it's not over for them. The story isn't over. Now, the family petitioned for the federal government to get involved and to bring up charges on the two gunmen who got acquitted. And MD, can you tell us why they were able to do that even though the state couldn't?
State charges and federal charges are different, which is what we're seeing like in this Diddy case, right? It looks different. They are different. While the murder charges is that was the state's charge, federal can still bring charges of RICO, bribery, corruption, extortion. They can still bring those charges. And I think it is so admirable of this family to petition the federal government. We can do that. That's within our rights. And then the federal government will take a look and see, is this something that we can win? And if we haven't already said this, if you haven't already heard this as it relates to Diddy, if the federal government is bringing charges against you, they have the evidence.
They have the evidence. So in this case, the federal government decided to get involved and they were successful. They brought up the murder charges on the two gunmen who got the acquittal in the state court. They were successful because in 2005, after having their trial, they were found guilty of murdering Derwin Brown. And they both received life sentences. But can we talk about Cuffee for a minute? Now, Cuffee pled guilty to felonious murder, which was the charges that he received when a year later, after doing the murder for hire plot with Derwin Brown, he was caught up in. That's how they initially caught him, on this felonious murder charge. He was sentenced to 12 months. Because remember, he got immunity for the other charges. 12 months. Yeah, I just thought I'd just spend time there.
Just sit there for a second, because you take a whole life and you sit out for a year.
So in the end, you talk about, was it a ploy to save his skin? I think he ended up saving it in the end.
He did. He saved it.
But as far as our takeaway, when you stand up for what is right, you have to know that it comes with risk, right? And I think Derwin Brown was willing to risk it all for the sake of his community first. He wanted to enact so much change and to do good. And I don't know if he thought that it meant that he would be murdered, but I think all of the corruption that he found, I'm pretty sure that was on his mind in some way. And sometimes when you stand up for truth, for right, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any other further implications. But as some of the great civil rights leaders that we adore and we really admire, when they stood up for right, they were assassinated. We have Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, we have Martin Luther King. We have those people that we look to, and they stood up for right, something that we all think you should just do. But for whatever reason, that cost them their life. And I just think it's so unfortunate, because I think he was well on his way to not just affecting change there in DeKalb County, but also, my God, what good could he have done in Washington? I think he was on his path to becoming a political figure that we would all admire. And my deepest condolences go out to his family, and his impact is felt, even though he is not here. We want to encourage you guys to leave us a comment about this case. I especially want to hear from my AT aliens because I'm sure you guys know about this case. I'm sure you heard about it. It is something that is very popular, very much like the child Atlanta murders. And I just want to know, where were you when this happened? If you're not too young for it, right? Let me know what your thoughts are. Definitely check in with us on social media. Let us know your thoughts about this case or any of the cases you've heard from us. And we will see you guys next week. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.